Good people, welcome. It is a great pleasure to introduce to you, of course, a very, very good friend and a former highly esteemed treasurer of the Waterloo Association, to whom we owe a great deal, a retired consultant surgeon. And of course, he has written many, many books, and I do hope that you have all got certainly this one, if not more, which is The Bloody Fields of Waterloo. So it is a wonderful privilege to introduce to you Mr. Mick Crumplin. Mick, sir, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, from a very chilly North Wales, it's very good to be virtually with you this evening. And I must say our thanks go to you, ONSEC, and to our Honorary Treasurer for their assistance with this talk. Tonight, I want to return to our root subject and give you a potpourri of issues around the Waterloo Campaign. First, I'd like to deal with the well-known quotation or obiter dictum concerning the battle being won on the playing fields of Eton, and then skip through the role of a few Eton and other public school alumni from the 15th to the 18th of June. And then I'd like briefly to mention some general issues about the fate of casualties in Brussels and Antwerp and other hospitals after the battle. These rare data were taken from an unpublished source in Edinburgh and written up by Gareth Glover and myself. Finally, I'd like to sum up the overall contribution of old Etonians to the campaign. And as usual, ladies and gentlemen, there will be a few graphic images which merely highlight and reflect the challenges of 19th century conflict. Well, now this beehive memorial is situated on a hill above Bollington village in Cheshire and memorializes the battle. On a fine day, it said it could be seen by ships entering the Mersey. Well, what about Wellington and Eton College? Our pupil, Wesley as he was then, for 3 years, was neither a very successful pupil there, lonely, but he could defend himself. He played pranks. He used to steal out before dawn and shoot wildfowl from the river near the college. I mean, he was withdrawn for one reason or another. I'm not sure which. But at Eton, he did jostle with some contemporaries, 30 of whom were aristocrats, and 7 of those became senior officers under his command later. In 1818, he visited his 2 sons and another visit in 1820 for the same reason. And then he was brought down, I'm not quite sure of the date, by General Harding, who you all know, for a visit, and had to attend, sadly, his brother's funeral, Richard, in 1842. Richard, incidentally, was one of the few men who'd attended both Eton and Harrow. In 1844, he was commanded to attend and escort the later deposed monarch, Louis Philippe, to the college. Now, the obiter dictum, which is usually a legal term referring to a passing remark or one issue that's not particularly relevant to the main subject under discussion or judgment, but it's probably apocryphal. There weren't any organized playing fields, although I am told that there were some areas where cricket was played. And a raconteur, historian, publicist, Charles de la Montalembert, in 1855, made the famous comment, "C'est ici qui a gagné la bataille de Waterloo." Later, Sir Edward Creasy, a lawyer and historian in a biography of called Eminent Etonians, wrote that the old Duke was heard to mutter, "There goes the stuff that won Waterloo." And this was a reference by Sir Lionel Cust, who was an art historian and a museum director, to the area called Mills at Sixpenny Corner, a boys' fighting venue, the site, of course, of the wall game. And by 1889, the well-known club raconteur, Sir William Fraser, whose father had fought at Waterloo and whose mother was related to General Robert Crawford, in his book, Words on Wellington, added playing fields to Montalembert's saying. So perhaps that's how the obiter dictum rolled out. Anyway, the most prominent Etonian at the battle, we all know, was the first Duke, and on his staff he had 14 Old Etonians, of whom 2 were wounded and 2 died of their wounds. The commander of the Second Corps, Lord Rowland Hill, a Shropshire man, didn't go to Shrewsbury Public School. Surprisingly, he went to King's in Chester. Perhaps his father wanted to keep him away from the comforts of home. He was a good country boy. Westminster was the school for Henry Paget, Lord Uxbridge. So we turn now to that famous social event hosted by the 4th Duke and his wife. The Duke had attended Westminster School and was in command of the garrison in Brussels. Interestingly, he found one of the founders of the MCC, and I'm not quite sure how proud he'd be of the team at the moment, the English team at the moment. But sadly, he came to an end 4 years after Waterloo when he was bitten fatally by a rabid fox. Anyway, at the ball, there were over 200 guests, and slightly less than half were British Army officers. There was actually one medical man there who was Wellington's personal physician and surgeon, Dr. Hume. But of those army officers, around 10% were Old Etonians, 6 of whom became casualties in the battle. And this wonderfully busy chart showing the comings and goings at the debacle at Quatre Bras, and we move to the 16th of June. The Etonian alumni casualties at Quatre Bras were 3 foot guards officers killed. One of them was Ensign Hay, who was acting as Maitland's ADC, and whose horse at Grammont had won a race, but refused a hedge here at Quatre Bras. And when the horse turned, he was fatally shot by a skirmisher in the head. And 1 other foot guards officer was wounded. Another Etonian who died of wounds was Dennis Pack's brigade major, Charles Smythe, who was actually quite an experienced Peninsular man in the rifles. But now we move to the battle, Sunday the 18th of June, and Hougoumont has to be defended. And as we know, the light companies of the Coldstreams and 3rd Foot Guards go down under MacDonald, with a substantial group of Nassau and Hanoverian troops. And they scatter themselves around the environment. And as the day goes on, more and more troops get pulled into the defense from Byng's 2nd Guards Brigade. And the Coldstreams largely occupy the formal gardens and the chateau. A few of the 3rd Foot Guards were there too with the Germans. But the toing and froing great assaults in the orchard, which you can see labelled from the south in the bottom picture, were defended by Lord Salton's 2 light companies of the 2nd, 3rd Battalions, the 1st Foot Guards, and also the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Foot Guards with the Germans. So some pretty fierce fighting there. And if we look at the Etonians who are at Hougoumont, we have 1, Lord Salton, in the 1st Foot Guards, 2 from the Coldstream Guards, and 4 from the 2nd Battalion of the 3rd Foot Guards. And it was 2 of these that were casualties fighting in the orchard. One was Captain Thomas Crawford, whose brother was in the light cavalry and survived, and the other was Lieutenant Robert Hesketh, who actually is buried not far from where I live in North Wales. And if you look to the right and see his memorial, you can see that his sufferings were severe and heartrending to his numerous relations and so forth. And actually his wound, he was nearly bayoneted in the 2nd assault on the orchard, and on the 3rd, he was shot in the neck and jaw. And I strongly suspect that he had difficulty swallowing and eating, and that was the prolonged problem. But he obtained a majority and died in 1828. As to the defense of the farm and its gardens, we have Lord Salton, who we've mentioned, who really was commanding the troops in the orchard outside. And I have to mention Colonel Henry Wyndham, because he was the only Wyndham sibling at that time who was not educated at Eton. He was educated privately, so he was amongst Etonians, and of course he was one of the 9 or so principal closers of the North Gate on the 2nd break-in. He also nearly captured Jerome Bonaparte as he trotted over with the advancing troops at the end of the day. And of course the Egremont estate were responsible for giving the new north gates to the farm. I'm only mentioning Noel Harris, who was from Uppingham, actually, his school, because a bit of new light has been thrown on this wonderful relic, this coat that shows evidence of the amputation of Harris's right arm. He was brigade major to Hussey Vivian. And the surgeon has slit the sleeve up and his arm humerus bone was shattered by a musket ball, but this reduced the kinetic energy before it penetrated his trunk. And you can see bottom right, a sort of flap of coat rather than a piece missing, which indicates the entrance of a spent ball. And Harris lived with that injury for the rest of his life with relatively little trouble. But it was actually only probably one musket ball. And he was actually operated on in Hougoumont the day after the battle. Well, we all know who this is, Picton, who was educated at a local Welsh school and went on to further his education in a French academy. But the thing about him was that some people may not know that he was quite grievously hurt at Quatre Bras with a sort of quite deep wound in his belly, which he concealed and came on to fight and die, leading the 5th Division during the battle. As to the assault by D'Erlon and the riposte by the Household and Union Brigades, heavy cavalry, there was one junior officer in the Royals who charged with them, a Cornet Cox, and there were 3 officers who went with the Household Brigade, 1 in the Life Guards, 2 in the Royal Horse Guards. The Life Guards man was injured, and one of the Horse Guards men was killed, Robert Pack. And in the delightful picture on the left, you can see a picture of the old Etonian dressed in pre-peninsular horse. Now, as we go on with the assault in the riposte to the D'Erlon's attack, we can see the death in a modern painting of Sir William Ponsonby, caught up and trying to escape from French cavalry. Now, he was a Harrovian, as was his cousin, Frederick Ponsonby, who did not succumb, thankfully, from 7 injuries. He was severely wounded. And here he's being shown being helped by the Baron de Lassalle, who was an Imperial Guards officer who gave him some brandy and propped him up and so on. And Ponsonby, when he was Governor General of Malta, was to meet de Lassalle later on in his career. But in Frederick Ponsonby's regiment, the 12th Light Dragoons, there were 2 Etonians, Captain Alexander Crawford, and we've just seen that his brother died at Hougoumont, and Captain Edwin Sands, who died of his wounds. One of the interesting things I found about the Etonians who served at Waterloo was there was a representative in every light cavalry regiment. And as you may know, Major Howard was the 3rd son of the Earl of Carlisle, was killed in the last charge of the day. And you can see him being carried off the field, a little vignette from the Maclise murals that Evelyn has told us about. But of these men in the light cavalry, 2 died and 7 were wounded. And that is a 56% casualty rate, which is enormous. And I suspect that many of these injuries were caused by fighting the French cavalry, meleeing around the squares and so forth. And we have to remember that injuries caused by cavalrymen, both to infantry, artillery, and other cavalrymen, were going to fall around the head and neck, as some of you well know with these illustrations by Charles Bell. And even the helmet at the top, which is a Crimean relic from the charge of the Heavy Brigade at Balaclava, doesn't always protect you as well as you think. I suppose I have to mention the Assistant Quartermaster General de Lancey, because it's such a poignant story, his death. He was privately educated in America and was shortly before the battle married to Madeline de Lancey. But at about 3 in the afternoon, a round shot smashed into his right side, glancing blow, actually threw him some distance from his horse. And he took several days to die, eventually found by his dear wife from severe internal bleeding. And 8 ribs had been displaced by the round shot. So a great story, and the account written by Madeleine de Lancey was much praised by Charles Dickens. Well, now, after the fall of La Haye Sainte, there were three notable casualties. Fitzroy Somerset, who went to Westminster School, had his right arm shot through and amputated by Dr. John Gunning, who was principal medical officer in the First Corps dressing station at Mont Saint-Jean. He went on to have rather an ignominious end with the difficult task of governing the Crimean campaign and dying of cholera. And then we had Arthur Hayland, commanding officer of the 40th Regiment, who'd been thrice wounded in the Peninsula. And I think he must have almost foretold his own death, because he writes this amazing letter, I'm sure many of you have read it, about how he was going to die at Waterloo. And then, of course, there was Lieutenant Colonel Sir Alexander Gordon, ADC, in the 3rd Foot Guards, who was one of Wellington's close friends, and his leg was amputated by Hume in Wellington's headquarters. And he had this crude guillotine amputation, which you can see illustrated at the bottom left. And he bled quite a lot on the field. I don't know how much he bled in surgery, but he bled to death after the operation. And whether an arterial ligature came off or whether he bled from venous continued oozing, I don't know. But in the early hours of the morning of the 19th, he passed away, another Etonian. Two more Etonians, both in the 2nd Battalion, 69th, both survived Quatre Bras. Ensign George Ainsley actually kept the regimental colour safe by falling onto it, as you know, the King's colour was taken. And Ainsley survived on the ridge after the fall of La Haye Sainte, despite the terrible fire. And he went on and was one of the co-founders of Cheltenham Boys College. And then we have Colonel Charles Morris at the bottom, who was commanding officer, who, though he survived Quatre Bras, was wounded badly and then killed by a shot in the head. As to the Eton alumni on the ridge in Maitland's brigade, 1st Brigade, there were 5 there, of whom 3 were either severely wounded or died. So they came under pretty heavy fire at during the day and at the attack of the Imperial Guard. And then we have, of course, Lieutenant General Sir Harry Clinton, an old Etonian, whose father had commanded the British Army in the War of Independence, and who had strangely attended the Battle of Austerlitz in the Russian headquarters as a liaison man. And then he went with Sir John Moore and had a slightly checkered career in the Peninsula, but was given the 2nd Division. And as you know, the 3rd Adams Brigade brought about the final chase-off of the Imperial Guard. Sir John Colborne of the 52nd, incidentally, was a Wycomist. And the last Etonian I want to talk about is, of course, our friend Percy, who bought the 2 Eagles. He's dressed incorrectly because he's in the 14th Light Dragoons, and there should only be 2 Eagles presented to His Royal Highness at 16 St. James's Square. But anyway, it was rumoured that he had been lightly wounded in the toe, and we don't really know the truth beside that. Now, I want to move away transiently from Eton and talk about some aspects of injury and aftercare. A lot of men were in 3 square miles and a bit more, 102,000 casualties, but that includes killed, died of wounds, wounded, and missing. And there were, I reckon, probably just over 60,000 wounded men to be looked after by the various medical people. Very dense casualty rate, as you know, over 2,200 mean casualties per mile of front. And there was 26 Eton alumni, dead or wounded, in the fields of the campaign. I've arrowed on the right 1 medical officer. What can he do in this terrible mess where many men bled out on the field? And indeed, any medical emergency response team with Chinooks and everything couldn't possibly do much with this either. It was such a lot of casualties in such a short time. And if we talk about casualties and we just think for a moment about the dead and wounded only, not the missing, not the prisoners, and we look at Waterloo alone, actually, battle, through at this point here in the middle, and the other Quatre-Bras, Ligny and Wavre also mentioned. And these figures are all a condensed accumulation, and I'm fairly sure they're pretty much okay. But the thing that bothers a lot of us, I suppose, is what were actually the French casualties in total during the Battle of Waterloo? And the figure of 20,000+ goes round many of our minds. So I thought I might get the answer when I read a book called Paul Dawson, produced in 2018, called Waterloo, The Truth at Last. Well, it wasn't quite as simple as that, and we didn't quite get the truth. I mean, he'd obviously done quite a lot of work on the data he managed to find from returns on dead, and I looked at dead and wounded only with the French, and I came up with a total of 5,725, which is far distant from 20,000 casualties. Now, I think these records are very incomplete. There were one or two inconsistencies in the figures as well. So we have to accept that. And we have to look perhaps for a further 15,000 men. Well, 7,000 missing, 7,500 prisoners of war, possibly. And we don't know how many of the missing or the prisoners of war were hurt or died later. When you look at the total Anglo-Dutch German, that's excluding the Prussian casualties, they're only less than 15,000, but 3 times more than the figure found in Dawson's book. I think there's a lot of more work to do. His kill to wound rate was very different also from that of the Allies. Now, it may be that if you round off half the missing, half the prisoners of war, and add them to the 5,700, you will get casualty rates that are fairly similar. I don't know. There may be a fair point in saying perhaps we didn't kill and hurt quite so many Frenchmen as we think, and many of them ran away, wounded or not. That may well be the case. But until every soldier's record is looked at in France in detail by regimental lists, we won't know the truth. Now, the wounded, as you know, were collected, a lot of them into Mont Saint-Jean farm here, illustrated in a painting and looked after and supervised by John Gunning. Convoys of casualties came down from the city of Brussels and started moving them up in probably a pretty uncomfortable way. And if we look at the map of the Kingdom of the Netherlands at this time, I've just indicated where many of the hospitals were. And I think we should concentrate really on Antwerp and Brussels because they probably held 90% or more of the casualties. You'll notice Louvain, Tongres, Liège, Namur all in black. That's because they held largely Prussian casualties. And obviously the ones nearer France held French casualties. But really Brussels and Antwerp are the places to concentrate on. In Brussels, there were 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 hospitals, principal hospitals, and 5 of them, indicated in pink, were called the Grand Hôpital Général de l'Armée d'Alliés, and they were given to us by the Belgians for our soldiers largely, although there were some foreigners, as you can see with the gendarmerie, some Frenchmen, French casualties there. And there were 4 other hospitals in Brussels, main ones. In Antwerp, there were 6 hospitals, but the Corderie and the Elizabeth in Antwerp were French, and in Termonde was occupied by French casualties, and we mentioned Louvain, Liège, Namur as being Prussian. The Channel Port hospitals of Ostend and Bruges were closed, and their staff moved into Brussels to help. So if we look at the walled city of Brussels, rather faint here, the north is to your right, we can see the principal blue squared British hospitals, but all the orange blobs in the city shows you what an enormous scattering there was of lazarets and hospitals in the city. And if we look at the sort of buildings that were taken, here the St. Elizabeth Hospital in Brussels, top left, and top right, the Faucon Barracks in Antwerp, and then down below, 2 hospitals belonging to the Prussians in Liège and Louvain. Big buildings, lots of space. And if we think of perhaps the total casualty load in Brussels being about 9,000 to 10,000. It's interesting that almost half those casualties were looked after in private houses. Now, we all know that happened, a lot of them returning to billets as casualties where they'd been before the battle, and they were chalk marked on the door as to their nationality and numbers and so on. But nearly half of them were in private dwellings. And so the Belgians, bless them, formed surgical teams, 23 of them, of which 18 teams were roving teams to go round the private dwellings and look after the casualties there. So what about the medical staff in Brussels? You know, well, the British, there was the Inspector General Robert Grant, who was brother-in-law to the Inspector General back in London. And he was in Brussels the whole time. And John Hume, being personal physician and surgeon to the Duke, went with the staff. As far as the Dutch, the sort of northern part of the kingdom, Siebold Justinus Brugmans was a brilliant physician and organizer and public health expert. And also they had a very good surgeon called Karl Mergel, who had, both of these men had worked with the French before Waterloo, and Mergel was in charge of the 2nd and 3rd Netherlands Division surgery. The two interesting people called Kirchhoff and Fallow were extensive diarists in the Napoleonic Wars. Wonderful, I think, but they didn't take part. And I think maybe they must have had enough, or maybe they didn't want to fight against their erstwhile allies. The Belgians, those on the more south part of the kingdom, Joseph Klaskens was the senior and first-class surgeon. He was an excellent man by all accounts. And Louis Soutin was one of several second-class surgeons, but we'll talk about him in a minute. But the Prussians had a director general called Gurk and two surgeon generals, Volsk and von Graeff. And you can see a picture of von Graeff there. He had charge of all Prussian hospitals. As far as the French surgeons are concerned, they didn't get much chance to help. Some of them were taken prisoners and were allowed to work. Pierre-François Percy, who was a very senior man, was really sick with cardiac failure, so didn't take part, though he'd been given command in the campaign. Jean-Dominique Larrey, twice captured and nearly shot as being mistaken for Napoleon and wounded, did come, and he worked in Louvain, and he met up with Louis Soutin, interestingly, one of his former pupils. Our personal principal medical officer in the Low Countries was this rather unheard of man, Robert Grant. We can't really find anything out about him. There's very little social data and so on, but he was a very experienced chap and very competent, serving in Flanders, Walcheren, etc. And he went on to the Army of Occupation in France. And he was, as I said, brother-in-law to Sir James MacGregor. And he died in 1864. And then one must give a lot of credit after the battle to the citizens of Brussels and Antwerp and their doctors and their medical doctors. Brugmans, who I mentioned before, these two illustrations show how well they've done after the battle in terms of private practice. But Brugmans actually arranged many citizens to turn out clean linen dressings, admit patients to their houses. He built huts and assembled clumps of tents and so on. And there was only one minor outbreak of disease in the city after the battle, because it was summertime, remember. And Klaskens performed very well with his team in Brussels. So we mustn't forget the Belgian contribution. And I mentioned this chap before, who was a friend of Larrey's, and he was 18 and not allowed to perform major surgery, i.e. amputations, without the presence of a senior man, but he did because of the pressure of work. And he, at a very young age, amputated successfully 20 men, but he went on to become Director General of the Belgian Medical Services. And these are some of the notices posted around Brussels to encourage treatment of prisoners, the care of the civilians, to provide bedding and so forth, and cleanliness and so on. Great public health performance. Now, we go on now to look at the fate of some of the wounded in Brussels after the battle. John Thompson on the left was a professor in Edinburgh, and his friend, the senior military man in Scotland, William Somerville, came with him. John Thompson went through the usual sort of promotional stages for a surgeon. He was actually quite a junior military surgeon. He was only a staff surgeon in 1815, but he already held the chair of military surgery, the only one in Britain, in Edinburgh. And he wrote a qualitative report on the injuries at Waterloo. He went on to be, had a chair in general pathology and wrote on various things, editing some works, and he died in 1846. But he liaised very carefully with Brugmans, and they ran a very tight show in Brussels. And the data we found, which was created by him, and I think all the line drawings are by him, were collected from those 5 principal hospitals for the Allies in Brussels. There were detailed case reports, line drawings, classification, return of wounds, return and outcomes of fractures, surgery, and so forth. And then at the end, general casualty results, which are all very interesting. As far as the case reports are concerned, they were beautifully written, quite clear, and signed by this one on the left is signed by John Boggy, staff surgeon, and the one on the right, John Roach, who was another staff surgeon. And so there were 25 of these reports written by staff surgeons or juniors. One of the juniors was Robert Knox. Some of you may well be aware of the Burke and Hare murders, and Knox was the unfortunate anatomist who claimed ignorance of knowledge that the corpses he was given to dissect had been murdered. But he was one of the hospital assistants writing reports. There were 18 British reports, 7 French prisoners of war reports. And it's interesting, if you look at the scatter through the anatomy of the body, they're well represented, and therefore they give us a lot of information. And they weren't all success stories. The overall mortality was probably double or treble the usual mortality rate at 60%. So it was a sort of audit, really. And then the line drawings, of which there were 176, but there were 4 duplicates, illustrated mainly British KGL people, a few French, Dutch, and so forth. Interestingly, of the 98 British soldiers illustrated, 78% of the injured men were infantry. And of the injuries, they were again well represented. So this again is helpful. Now I'll just give you a few examples. From the Faucon Hospital in Antwerp, we have Sergeant Davis of the 23rd of Foot, Royal Welsh, and a musket ball had pushed a bit of skull into his brain, and as per usual, he was bled because he was febrile and unwell. But when Mr. Wilmore, the attending surgeon, removed the bit of bone, the epilepsy and his headaches ceased. Here's one from the Annonciate Hospital in Brussels with Samuel Pritchard of the 4th Regiment of Foot. And he's got a ball entering his forehead and lodging behind the left eye. We're not sure whether that was removed, nor that he was blinded, but he did survive. And this is interesting because this man is the only one I've been able to tie up between Thompson's line drawings and Charles Bell's sketches, which many of you know so well. From the Faucon Hospital in Antwerp again, Neil Johnson of the Inniskillens was wounded with a bit of shell case which exploded near him and went into his groin. But when the surgeon explored the wound, and you can see on the little illustration figure 2, he found a soldier's musket feather spring lying across the femoral artery. So the bit of shell must have smashed a musket and gone into Johnson's thigh. Then James Twiner, one of the many foot guards, first foot guards injured from the Annonciate Hospital, who had an injury at the top of his thigh, but they noticed this hard lump labeled B, C, and D. And it turned out that it was a piece of shell fragment weighing 9.5 ounces, and it was removed nearly a month after the battle. But I do love this comment by the surgeon: the patience and cheerful disposition of this man contributes to his recovery. The discharge has generally diminished and his strength has increased. And lastly, from the Elizabeth Hospital in Brussels, Peter Matthews of the 28th Regiment had a ball enter his right iliac fossa, which is the appendix region, as you know. Normally, if that punctured his colon, it would be death by peritonitis. But sometimes these injuries cause a swelling of the lining of the gut, and they occlude the orifice through which gut contents could escape into the peritoneal cavity. And also there's this greater omentum, this great sheet of fat seen on the right, which tends to act as a policeman and congregate at the site of trouble. So he survived because we know that, because he passed his musket ball per rectum later on. This rather horrendous non-standard form was drawn up by John Hennon, a very well-renowned Irish surgeon who wrote a lot. And these are wounds suffered in the Jesuit hospital. And you can see at the top, head, thorax, abdomen, limbs, etc. And they give you all sorts of details about outcome. And on the right, you can see whether it was gunshot or incised wounds, complicated fracture or a simple one, and amputations with mortality. So this rather complex thing is a good form to extract data from. And if you do that on lower limb injuries, and we look at 176 cases of lower injury, and take note on the right side, there are only 80 upper limb injuries. And there's always, pretty much always, nearly double the amount of lower limb wounds. The mortality rates are in orange, and there's a 9% mortality rate with limb injuries. And you can see again, there's a good scatter of the type of injuries and the type of anatomy that they were in. 174 gunshot wounds, 2 incised wounds. Of the complex fractures noted, there was a 21% mortality, and that would have been through bleeding or infection. And the amputation mortality rate was extremely high here. Probably pretty nasty cases. Another non-standard military form. These forms were used for reports afterwards, and this is a return of operations in the Elizabeth Hospital. It's not about wounds, this is about surgery and the results. And that's signed, interestingly here, by William Ray, a physician to the forces, who was one of the 2 men who had a slight injury during the campaign. We can sum up the surgical results. If we look at the mortality by wound site in 322 patients, and these are all from the Brussels hospitals, 15% mortality of those who survived by head and neck, 25% thorax, only 9% of abdominal wounds. That's because most of them will not have reached hospital by fatal bleeding. And you will note that the lower limb has 3 times the mortality of the upper limb. The next 2 lines are related because primary surgery and elsewhere surgery, 22 and 38% mortality respectively, are done near to the site of injury, quickly after injury. Whereas secondary surgery at the general hospital, okay, it can mean there were more severe injuries, but they were done later, which is not always beneficial. And they have 37 and 55% mortalities higher. So the message here, obviously, is to get on and operate if it's required as soon as possible and the patient's fit enough. If we look at surgical results on the limb, 374 cases, we see a 23% mortality in the upper limb, 35% mortality with lower limb injuries. And lastly, the surgical results from, firstly, the different hospitals. And it's interesting here that if you look at the Elizabeth and Jesuit hospitals, both with fairly large numbers of operations, it's pretty constant. Between 1/4 and 1/3 of them die. Whereas the Annunciate and Minim Hospital, 51, 35%, quite high, 37 and 40%, but much smaller numbers of cases. And it may be these were later presenting or they had less good surgeons. But what is interesting is that the gendarmerie mortality is very high. And we must remember that a lot of those cases will be the late collected French. If we look at the combined studied hospital results, the 6,500 wounded had an 11% mortality overall. But if you were operated on, that expands nearly 4 times and is an indication of the severity of the wound, the lateness of presentation, and of course the lack of knowledge and facilities that we have today. And the overall Allied hospital mortality was just under 10%. I would like to remind you that there is now a nice little museum of surgery actually in the First Corps dressing station at the farm of Mont Saint-Jean, kindly set up by Anthony Martin, who is a kind donor and owns the farm, has a distillery and a business there as well. But it's well worth a visit if you haven't done so. And it's fairly unique in Europe as being the only museum of medicine, military medicine, on the battlefield in the actual hospital precinct. There's some interesting things there, quite apart from surgical stuff. There are some macabre relics. This is the 2 musket balls which distorted and then straightened a young rifleman's neck, French musket balls, and down below the shrapnel ball, it might have been a blue on blue, I fear, that killed the senior officer killed in the 27th, George Holmes, Captain George Holmes. And you can see the pedicle of his second thoracic vertebra in the silver set bone is missing, and that's because the ball went into his chest that way. And his wife had this memento mori presented. On the left, you can see the crutches donated to the museum by the current Lord Uxbridge very generously. Many of you probably are familiar with the splendid work done by the veterans and run by Waterloo Uncovered, Mark Evans, CEO, and trained archaeologists helping the veterans to explore the battlefields for war relics and also medical artifacts, which we've begun to find now in the orchard of the farm of Mont Saint-Jean. So let's go back now to Waterloo and other public schools for a moment. Eton, interestingly, had the largest number of officers on the battlefield in the 5 schools I studied. I haven't done them all, of course, but they beat Harrow by a short margin. Rugby actually produced 1 surgeon, which is unusual because the surgical status and education was often rather more simple and lowly than expensive private schools. And Eton's contribution was, of course, the commander-in-chief and 60 other Etonian alumni, of whom nearly half had a profoundly aristocratic background. And if we look at the ranks of the old Etonians serving at the battle, we have about a third are a field rank and above, and the rest are more junior officers and a deputy commissary general. And we need to pause for a minute to look at the distribution of old Etonians in the battle formations. 14 of the 61 were staff, 20 were in the cavalry and most in the light cavalry, 18 in the foot guards, only 8 Etonians served in line infantry, which figures, I guess, 1 in the commissariat. Now, if you look at the white figures in brackets, we have 29 and 25% mortality in the staff and line infantry. But if we pick out the light cavalry and the foot guards, we've got 50% casualty rate or more. Pretty significant. So 12 were killed outright or died of wounds, and 14 were wounded, half of whom severely, which gives a 43% casualty rate, which is nearly double that of most officers on the field. So I thought I'd compare Eton and Harrow and the distribution of the boys in various units in each school and from each school. And interestingly, Eton had less on the staff, more in the foot guards and cavalry, but actually the Harrovian casualty rate was pretty high, higher than that of Eton. And because there are yet quite a lot of unknown issues over Waterloo, and probably will continue so for a long time, the words of the Duke are probably quite wise. And we finish really with the saying of the famous historian Trevelyan, that the Battle of Waterloo was won not on the playing fields of Eton, but on the village greens of England. The men who fought on the 18th of June were very little educated, but they had the qualities of country-bred men. Well, I think one can understand why he said that, but I would suggest that the private schools had made enormous contributions in the way of suffering and to the success of the battle. And of those, there's no doubt that Eton held the torch. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Mick, that was really, really splendid. If you would like to stop sharing screens, sir, then people will be able to see a bit more of you. There we go. Fantastic. That was always erudite. I just have, good people, one fault to bring out in Mr. Crumplin's presentation, which is his reference to a nice little museum of surgery at Mont Saint-Jean, where he mentioned Anthony Martin, and he mentioned some other people, but he did not, because he is such a humble man, mention the fact that this museum of surgery at Mont Saint-Jean is his creation, with many examples from his own collection. If you do watch on the various channels, you'll see Mick talking Sean Bean through what it was actually like at Waterloo. So we are actually indebted to Mick Crumplin for the Museum of Surgery. Mick, I just wanted to say that, sir.
Thank you very much. Very kind.
So, good people, I've got a number of questions coming in. Please fire them to me on chat. And Mick, I'm going to go straight into a question on Eton, or rather on public schools. This comes from John Haynes. John, thanks so much for sorting out or giving me advice on where the problem was with that sound earlier on. And John's question is as follows. And he says, apologies, this may be too big a question. The popular view of public schools is largely from the mid-19th century. I know my own school, Highgate, was not in a good way in the late 18th, early 19th century. What would have been the, in inverted commas, style of Eton, etc., in the late 18th century?
Well, I'm not an expert on British public schools. I wish Anthony Selden was here. He could tell you a lot more. But anyway, I think we're looking at an Eton at that time of probably 200 or 300 boys only. And as you can probably imagine, the great theme was on the study of classics. And I suspect an awful lot of that went on because many of these men would go on to Cambridge and become academics as well. But I can't give you much on that, I'm afraid.
Mick and I were chatting about this when we did the run through on Sunday, and Mick posed me the question. He said, and what's it like for the Ponsonby family? And I promised I'd find out. And the book that was published in the late 1920s privately for the Ponsonby family does break them down as regards public school. And it's really quite interesting because for most of them, if they are going to a private school, do go to Eton, but it's not in the 18th century. So the book shows that only 2 of them went to Eton before 1800, but after 1800, in the 19th century, 21 went. And as regards Harrow, 3 went to Harrow before 1800, but in the 19th century, it was 13. And I wondered if one of the things that perhaps was going on there was certainly the Ponsonby family in the 18th century is one of the 3 leading families in Ireland. Their education is through Kilkenny High School, and then it's Oxford or Cambridge. But in the 19th century, when they're breaking into English society, when the family, one of the main branch of family is absentee landowners, and they break into English society, then it becomes necessary to attend a public school because of social connections. I don't know what you think about that, Mick.
No, I don't really have any comment about that, no.
Let me give you one from Mo Dewar. Have you any data on survival corrected for seniority of surgeon?
Thank you, Mo. Well, I think it's interesting that 1 or 2 of the hospitals with larger numbers who I know were directed, they probably didn't have all their surgery by very well established peninsular surgeons, did have slightly better results. The trouble is, if you put a good surgeon in another hospital and you give him a load of bad patients and you can't correct for that factor, you get skewed data. So it isn't an easy question to answer. I'm quite sure, given the same kind of severe wounds, senior surgeons who had experience, people like Guthrie in the Peninsula, would have had eminently better results than some others, yes.
Brilliant. Questions are coming in thick and fast, Mick. John Deverill, when did the medical profession realise that bleeding patients was not a good idea? And why did they ever think it was?
The answer to the first question, it began to disappear from general practice in Britain in about the 1830s. The practice was thought to be abhorrent by Guthrie and John Hunter, and by Baron Larrey, three eminent surgeons, because they knew their patients were bleeding out. And the answer to your question as to why was it used was to address the humoral theory of disease. In other words, somebody with a high bounding pulse, delirium, red-faced, sweating, with fever, why not bleed him and remove some of this blood that was causing this reaction? And bleeding was actually demanded by eating officers in the peninsula who were perfectly well. They thought it was a great thing to reduce the blood. The other thing that's interesting is, I don't know if you've ever got out of the bath quickly and felt slightly faint. It's not an unpleasant feeling, as long as you don't pass out. But that slight dizziness, is something that they felt to divert their mind from whatever they were suffering with. So that was their perception of the benefit of bleeding. But the answer to your question was, it was to rebalance health with fever and sepsis by bleeding the patient, making him cooler and paler. Quite ridiculous, but those were the reasons.
John did ask a supplementary, which was, were there some cases where bleeding people was a good idea?
Yeah, sure. I mean, people, not so much wounded men, but people in cardiac failure, not from bleeding out. If you remove blood volume, you reduce stroke volume and improve cardiac performance, but not really in wounded men. No, there was no benefit whatsoever there.
Thank you. I've got a question from Clyde, who thanks you for your presentation. Mick, question: did these schools, such as Eton and Harrow, encourage their students to enter the army?
Again, I have no idea. I mean, I would have thought, to be quite honest, there would be a faint disappointment of them going into the armed services, because, as we know, it was often a second choice in grand families to post someone off to the Navy or Army. I would have thought, I would guess that most public schools would rather their alumni went to some academic height better than becoming a sort of rather late promoted subaltern or something. Yeah, sure.
I've got a question from Paul Grunye. Mick, you mentioned Brugman having some success with the setting up of outstations to hospitals in Brussels. Yeah. What do you think were the factors in this success?
Well, I think by scattering the huts and tent encampments around the parks and so on, he spread people out. Think of COVID today. It's the same thing. There was an outbreak of dysentery, but then that was probably from an infected water source. It wasn't a great event. But I think by spreading everyone out, by putting all these 4,200 patients into private homes, he was isolating them from the contagion of wards.
Great, thank you. Dennis, I don't know if anybody's going to know the answer to this question, but Dennis asks, do you know how many Etonians were killed at the Somme and how this compared with Waterloo?
No, but it could be that Anthony Selden's book might tell you, but I can assure you that more Etonians died on the Somme than at Waterloo.
Thank you. Now, I've got a question from Paul Chamberlain here, if I can just get myself able to scroll up the chat function properly. Do you know when the wounded French prisoners who eventually recovered were sent back to France from Belgium?
No. The trouble is, there's this gap between Waterloo and the capitulation of Paris, etc. And it may be that they were kept. I often thought about this, and I thought they might have been held in Belgium rather than shipping them all the way over to Paul Chamberlain's favorite places. Honestly, I just don't have any data on that. I'm quite sure some people with severe wounds who'd recovered or had destitute families in France, the medical profession would have probably slipped them over the border too.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got a question on Phil Buckley, which is going to link into the Navy. I should point out, good people, that Mick was also the medical consultant for that wonderful film starring Russell Crowe called Master and Commander, Far Side of the World. But Phil's question is this, Mick. Were the medical standards typical for the period? How does the Army's performance at Waterloo, for example, compare to the Navy's standard of mortality and survival?
It's a good and difficult question because there's never been any trial to look at Navy surgeons against Army surgeons. There cannot be, and they are presented with very different problems. One of the advantages of being a casualty in the Royal Navy, if that's not an oxymoron, is that you're very near to your surgeon when you get hit. And that's good. It wasn't in Nelson's case because he was so badly hit he was going to die anyway, and there's nothing the surgeon can do. It would have been better if he died far off as far as the surgeon was concerned, but they are nearer to medical help. There is no evidence from the Court of Examiners and general standards that a good or an average RMO or ship's naval officer were very different from each other. I've got plenty of examples of drunken naval surgeons, of cock-ups and successes in the Navy as in the Army. It would be a very difficult thing to pronounce on. They both had very similar training. And I think the other thing you've got to remember is that there were far more casualties in the Navy from accident, disaster and disease and climate than there were in the British Army. I think it's something like 6% of naval victims were war victims, whereas about 25% of the Army were war victims. So it was a different clientele. But I'll tell you something, if I was a surgeon on a ship, I'd want to dust myself off pretty well. And I suppose the same applies to a regiment. So the answer to your question is, I don't have a finite answer. There is no evidence that one arm of the service was better than the other, but the Royal Navy always feel better than anybody anyway.
Yes, so true, so true. Sir, Mike Robinson asks, what do we know of the fate of those who never made it off the battlefield? Have significant grave pits been found in the vicinity of the various dressing stations and field hospital locations?
We have to accept that a lot of men who died on the battlefield or after surgery or admission to a hospital were buried in mass graves. There are pictures and accounts to back that up. In the orchard round Hougoumont, under the south aspect of the south gate at Hougoumont, along the chaussee down to Charleroi on the right-hand side, in the orchard of Mont Saint-Jean, and on the crossroads too, where the Belgian victims were buried. We know that, but probably they're not there. And Waterloo Uncovered is finding things, certainly, and so certainly some medical relics. But there's a lot of evidence that the bones were dug up, not only from Waterloo, but from all over Europe and sent to Newcastle to be processed onwards in the northeast of England for fertilizer. And so I'm afraid the human relics and animal relics are fairly sparse because of that reason.
Very sobering. So you may have a Waterloo man in your back garden and not know it, I suppose. I've got a question from Adrian Clark here, Mick. Were any military practices, were any medical practices or techniques taken back and then adopted by civilian medical practitioners?
Yeah, I'm not so much techniques, because there was such a limited variety of surgery until anesthesia and antisepsis came. Surgery had a very limited repertoire. You can imagine that. Amputation, searching wounds, setting fractures, trephining the skull, exploring an artery. So very few. What did happen was that the experienced surgeons from these wars took home a wealth of experience. You've got to remember that someone like Guthrie, who became a consultant at the Westminster Hospital, had operated on over 20,000 men in the peninsula. Well, that's got to count for something. So it's experience they brought, and perhaps timing and, quickness, doing the same procedures, but better. Because, in civilian practice, a chap would be lucky to witness 10 or 15 amputations in his civilian training. Not so in the armed services.
I have a question about teeth extraction, Mick. A question, we hear about teeth being taken from the dead on the battlefield. Was dentistry a military surgeon specialty, or were they generalists by nature? I was going to say they were hairdressers, hence the old barber's pole, but I'm going to be proved wrong. Go for it, sir.
No, you're absolutely right. It had to be in the repertoire to remove teeth with fairly crude instruments. And if you study the history of surgical instrumentation, you find that actually dental instruments don't appear in staff or regimental surgeons' kits till about 1840. And so it was down to whoever, I mean, there were people who drew teeth who were farriers as well. So it wasn't a speciality, it wasn't a recognized taught issue. And I know that there was one splendid account somewhere in the peninsula where a surgeon used to scrape gold and silver coins, and with the scrapings, he used to pound them into amalgam. No doubt he to fill fillings in officers' teeth. No doubt he charged quite a lot for that. But no, dentistry was in its infancy. The Royal Dental Corps wasn't formed until, well, not long after the RAMC in 1898.
Thank you so much. Other comments that people are making, apart from thanking you for the talk, Erwin is, well, I know you've been in correspondence with, I believe French wounded held in Brussels with citizens often escaped back home, so there's very few escaped is in inverted commas, if you know what I mean. So few records there. There is only small evidence of French prisoners of war transported to the north, probably non-wounded. John Devil, of course, is an old Etonian. You could see for good people the comments about the visit of the Duke to Eton in a book, Eton of Old, or 80 years since. Erwin has also said that Brugman also collected skull from numerous battlefields in Europe, along with those of Waterloo. There seems to be some still in the medical museum in Leiden. So there we go. Or John Arnott, fascinating subject, delivered with an incredible depth of knowledge. Thank you. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And I think that is a wonderful way, sir, to end as always and say how much we are indebted to you. Do you want to do a sales plug on some of your latest books? Please feel free.
No, well, not particularly. You can Google them if you wish, but I think Gareth Glover and I wrote the account of the treatment of the wounded after the battle, which is a very rare set of data, and I think a very poignant account of what happens. We forget what happens and to the wounded men. We forget the suffering of civilians, and we forget the efforts of the medics. And it's called Waterloo. I've forgotten what it's called. Waterloo After the Glory, it's called. And it's got these sketches and reports in, which do make perhaps intermittent reading not a book to plow through. It's a pick up and put down book, you know, but anyway, some interesting data. But thank you, John, for your kind words and your management of the lecture.
My pleasure, sir. Good people, I think we have been indebted to Mick and another wonderful lecture in this series.